Good morning, Kiran. It was so good to see you.
Good morning, Marcelo.
We miss you. We wish you were here.
I wish so too, but I've got Mahatma Gandhi looking over me, so I'm just saying we all are sending our wishes from India.
Beautiful. You're well?
Very well, thank you.
How is your husband?
Oh, touch wood, I can't complain. We're just taking it a year at a time.
Beautiful. Give him my regards.
I will.
We'll get started in about 1 minute.
Super.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm delighted to have folks join us both from here within the Casa Pew and as well as on Zoom for the third session on the pandemic in comparative perspective. We will begin with Kiran Sethi on Zoom on a session on the pandemic in Asia, regional perspectives. Thank you very much, Kiran.
Thank you so much for having me. I really wish I was there. I'm going to just do the screen share so that I could start. Yes. So, namaste, buongiorno, and good morning to all of you. You certainly know there's something very wrong with the world when we start a greeting by saying, I hope you're all staying positively negative. Thank you, dearest Marcelo and the members of the Pontifical Academy of thinking of me for this event. And thank you for your time and intent for all our children. By now, of course, we are aware that over 1 billion children have suffered the impact of school shutdowns. And we also know this is going to have a long-lasting effect on the learning and well-being of our children. We know from previous crises that the longer they stay out of school, the less likely they are to return. We've already heard from the eminent speakers about the global scale of the impact. I would like to share some light on how the pandemic has affected and impacted children and learning in India. You see, India holds a lot of records and a lot of achievements. We are the largest democracy, one of the fastest growing economies. We produce the highest number of movies every year, and we give yoga to the world. COVID, unfortunately, has added one more rather dubious distinction to this list. We now hold the record for having the longest pandemic-induced school closure. So let me share the impact of this decision in terms of data. Over 320 million children, which is about the population of the United States of America, have not stepped into a classroom for over 1.5 years. From these 320 million, over 40% of children, that is 128 million children, received actually their only meal of the day at school, which meant that besides the loss of learning, basic nutrition was also locked down. The sudden and immediate impact saw an exodus of over 10 million migrants back to their hometowns. Some, like 15-year-old Jyoti Kumari, had to cycle over 1,200 kilometers from Gurgaon back to home, carrying her ailing father in the cycle. Whilst we still don't know how many of the migrant children might return to any form of schooling, we do know that 30% more children, girls specifically, are entering into early marriages. This, of course, brings another set of issues such as teenage pregnancies and malnutrition. 90% of children lost at least one specific language ability, which experts say will take around 9 years to overcome. So for all this talk of going digital, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed how rooted structural imbalances are between rural and urban, male and female, rich and poor, specifically in the digital world and specifically in India. From inequity in electricity and internet connections to devices like computer or smartphones, The data revealed of the 117 million children in rural India, only 8%, that is 9 million children, had access to any form of online education. Nationwide, only 11% of our 1.5 million schools in India were equipped with internet facilities to offer continued education, online education. And finally, the government schools data showed that pre-pandemic, 55% of children under 10 were not able to read and comprehend a simple text. And now, post-pandemic, this number has gone up to a whopping 45%. How did India respond? Literally overnight, we witnessed unprecedented design innovations. Tech startups found the pandemic an opportunity to help bridge some of these gaping inequity. From skills to vocational and technical courses, we saw myriad solutions emerge. The government set up a team to digitize over 4,000 textbooks, adding QR codes and tagged them with approximately 200,000 pieces of e-content, which included 6,000 documents, 1,500 interactives, et cetera, This was set up for school and college courses. The states harnessed the reach of local television, 34 educational channels were broadcasting content, and radio stations to continue to deliver lessons. A helpline called Yukti was also set up for stress and anxiety. But in record time, while we cracked the formula of the vaccine so the world could get back to a life as we know it, the truth is there is no getting back to anywhere. Imagine the world our children were witnessing. For the first time, they were being told that to love somebody is to stay away from them. Be afraid, we were telling them. Be very afraid of hugs, of smiles, of you and of me. They say time heals all wounds. So while our children might recover physically, what vaccine will heal the damage this virus has caused to the hearts and minds of our children? How will they build their immunity to the viruses of fear, loneliness, and anxiety? What will it take to bring courage back? So COVID made one thing eminently clear. No more will schools be seen as institutions for passing tests and time, but as those last standing bastions of hope where children will learn about equity, justice, joy, and purpose. A recent survey conducted with over 600 students showed what they really wanted most from schools. The results are not surprising, but if only we were to listen to them. 90% children said that the school was for making long-lasting friendships. 84% said that schools offered emotional support and how to deal with anxiety. 73% said that schools helped get feedback for growth. And 65% said that they found their talents at school. So what will it take to turn this COVID crisis into a re-COVID crisis opportunity? At Riverside School, really, we have been waiting for this for the last 20 years. Ironical as it may sound, I was super grateful for 2020. Never before had the world awakened to the power of empathy and emotional well-being as a super fuel for education. Yes, while technology and learning apps have certainly given us the confidence that we can learn about things by ourselves, it also highlighted that we can only learn about ourselves with each other. So when we started the school in 2001, we had just one simple goal: to graduate young citizens who are aware of the world, enabled with skills, and empowered to design a more desirable and humane world. We call this the I Can mindset. How are we doing this? Well, we use principles of design thinking to create a simple 4-step framework of putting empathy into empowerment. We called it FIDS for Kids: feel, imagine, do, and share. Feel, always start with the heart. We invite children to observe and identify what bothers them in their immediate environment and what they wish to see changed. Imagine, then children collaborate with friends and teachers and brainstorm about what change looks like. Do, we ask them to implement the act of change. And then finally, share. My favorite part, asking children to shamelessly share their story so others can also be inspired to say, I can. The result of this, and the reason I want to share this, is that every time a child experienced being the change, they were forever changed. So just to illustrate the power of FIDS, I would like to show you one glimpse of FIDS in action. This is a story of my youngest children who designed a solution for the school handyman as a way to make his job less stressful. The biggest lesson they were teaching us is that age had nothing to do with competency.
There are 4 simple steps: feel, imagine, do, and share. Just start by first feeling. What are you trying to solve?
The problem was that Sunil Bhai, he likes to do a lot of work, but then he had to run back and forth. Sunil Bhai had to go everywhere.
Then we said, what do we do after we understand? We imagine a preferred scenario. There is the imagine.
We hear each other's ideas so that we can come up with better solutions. First of all, like Earth had got the idea that we can make a belt. We were making a jacket. We talked, we will make lots of pockets.
And then you go out and do the action.
We illustrated first how the belt will look. First, cut the sleeves. We stitched, then we cut. Then we sticked only on 3 sides, and so it became a pocket.
And then you share it. I think one of the key things that we've learned is we were not sharing. We were just not sharing enough in education.
We talked about with him that why we made this for him, how it will be useful for him. We were telling him that he cannot waste his time and his energy. He was feeling happy because now he didn't have to run all over the place to find the keys. He just had to take it out from his pocket and give it to the person who wants it.
To have our children have creative confidence is probably the greatest gift you can give them. Well, they are the 2 most powerful words in the English language. I can.
So COVID is not the only crisis the world is currently witnessing, but it has highlighted that uncertainty is the only certain we can be certain about. And our children need tools to not only navigate, but shape this uncertain world. So Riverside is offering the FIDS formula as a vaccine. Our children need to build the antibodies of empathy, courage, passion as they unleash their agency for the greater good. So before I bid you farewell, allow me to share my insights to this moment in history. We are here today, while so many of our loved ones are not. Our rooms may be quieter and our hearts heavier. Never before have the words today and now played such a significance in the choices we make. So, and our children are watching us, will we choose to turn this crisis into an opportunity or continue to advocate for a system we know is broken, that only values children being markable and not remarkable? Why is this I can message so important for our children, especially in times of such crisis? Well, it encourages them to believe that the tiny corner of the world and the planet they inhabit can be made more beautiful, more just, and more equal. More importantly, it teaches them that they do not have to be mere spectators of change. They can be the initiators, the participants, and the overseers of it today. So, what are we waiting for?
Ministers of education today are so consumed with science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and having higher test scores that they forget that at the end of the day, if we don't have people of good character, people who do the right thing, intellect in itself will destroy the world. It will not save it. The world has a lot to learn from what's happening here at Riverside School.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kiran, for giving us starting us off with a perspective that is focused a little less on the Western world and giving us an inspirational model where we can begin to think about the opportunities out of this sobering moment that is really using a social emotional learning vaccine, if you will. And I think that what are the teachable moments out of this time? So thank you very much for that. We are just a few minutes early, so we can actually entertain questions at this moment before we go to the next speaker.
Thank you so much for this beautiful presentation. It's inspiring to see what children can contribute to the world in this moment of crisis. It also makes me think, as a psychologist focused on trauma, is that what this program is proposing is not just building character and empathy and traits that are going to be beneficial to humankind, but when a child is able to help an adult in distress, starting with their parents, of course, we know this from the field of battered women's studies, when a child is able to materially help a distressed parent, it builds a level of self-esteem that's extremely important, and it helps them survive trauma, including the trauma of a pandemic. So it's just inspiring to see this work being done. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. In fact, I just wanted to share that we've done the FIDS we ran with the Rohingya migrants who'd come to Bangladesh. And remember, children using the FIDS and not feeling victimized. They didn't feel as victims, they felt as agents of change. And even in the refugee camps, they were able to see themselves as empowered. You know, that I remember a story, one of the child's grandparents didn't know when to have his medicine on time. So that became their story of change, where they created a little simple calendar to say that who will check in on their grandparents so that he could have his medicine. So even just as you said, ma'am, just in times of great distress, I think to be able to give children the possibility of hope and to say that they can, just I have seen shifts the way they think of their role in the world.
And that's such an important skill set to take into the world, to go out of learned helplessness and into a sense of agency that will serve them well in all, at the moment of crisis as well as throughout the lifetime. So thank you so much for that. Stefania?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Well, first of all, I wish to join Melissa in congratulating. I was very much inspired as well. It's a very good way to start the day. And I think it's really a very concrete example of what learning to care means. Feeling, sharing, doing, imagining are the four dimensions which are very much at the core of what we call global citizenship education in the SDG 4 roadmap, and how UNESCO, I explained a little bit yesterday, very much focusing on. I have a couple of questions, if I may. One is about different levels of education you are focusing on. This example was from the primary school, I suppose. And all examples we have also in our network of schools, UNESCO, which are very close to this approach, I saw all of them mostly from the primary schools, and I understand why. I mean, it's a little bit more, it's easier, right, to give this kind of environment and involve children like this. So I would like to know if there are good examples at secondary, with adolescents and maybe young people. Second, you mentioned teachers as initiators, and This is a point we discussed very much yesterday. I'm very much obsessed by the importance of teachers in the classroom with a different approach, a different empowerment. So I would like to know if you work on that side and if you have some, I also saw Global Teacher Prize as partners, and we are very much working with the scholars. Thank you very much. Once again, congratulations.
Thank you, Stefania. In fact, we have over 30,000 now stories of change across the board, starting as young as 3 and going up all the way to 16. Our sweet spot, though, which we've done a study, is your 11 and 12-year-olds are your greatest change makers because they're old enough to take agency and to have the choice, and young enough not to be worried about exit examinations. However, since we work with every kind of school across the world, we are now in 60 countries, we find that teachers are using the FIDS framework as a beautiful tool even for CAS projects or for special needs. We have, in fact, my partner in Malawi is working with visually impaired children. So we've cut across. The FIDS framework is super universal, super flexible, and because it works on context. So we have evidence of children using it across their entire learning journey. So I think that's a proven thing. And yes, teachers are using now FIDS as a pedagogical tool. Rather than just start by focusing on the what and how, they're now focusing on the who and the why. So the feel and imagine is giving them the lens to start by saying, who is our child? Why is this learning important? And then focus on the do, which is the what and the how, and the share component, which has never been really encouraged in education, has become the ability to tell larger stories, not just within your school, but to share the larger landscape of learning that this is possible. And children across the world are using this tool to be active participants in the world.
Kiran, thank you so very much for your inspiring initiation of this session. We now need to move to our next guest speaker. I hope you will stay with us until for the next 2 sessions so you can join us in the discussion. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I would like to now introduce Pearl Sithole from the University of the Free State in South Africa. She will speak on family decisions on health and economic survival, a struggle for inclusive mercy in Southern Africa. Thank you very much, Professor Sithole.
Thank you very much, Chair, and good morning, colleagues. I also want to start with sincere gratitude to have been afforded this opportunity of exposure to such depth of analysis on a subject that is so concerning to all of us. And also just because the spirit of this gathering is both about the depth of analysis and the seeking of solutions. So thank you very much for this. I am going to present a paper that is actually conceptual, much to the deception of the title. And I'm doing this for 2 reasons. The first one is that there is a concern that I have held for a while around framing the relationships within the globe and finding out why certain areas of the globe, the regions of the globe, are trapped into some kind of ditch that is constantly being worked on constantly by other regions. And so they are more recipients of help than active in terms of being seen out there as well. They can be active for their condition, but in terms of being seen out there, there is a concern around that. And secondly, I also am presenting this paper because I'm hoping to learn from reactions whether there is anything like we are seeing, particularly in South Africa, where we have a phenomenon called fallism, where the youth, they started long before COVID, to start wanting things to fall. You will know, because the spillover went all the way to Europe at some point. They wanted roads to fall. They want fees to fall. And what we've seen is that during the COVID pandemic, when we were all, then there was a lot of empathy and sympathy around this problem. We also saw the fallism happening even digitally. And so if you look at the youth, and we are now moving away from primary schools to universities, and you look at how they are using all of the platforms to continuously drum the idea of fallism, you begin to wonder what is unique about this environment that makes the youth so uncomfortable. And what is it perhaps that we as the generation senior have done or not done to actually cause this discomfort of the youth? And so this paper, colleagues, is going to do two things very quickly because of time. The first one is to suggest that there's something in the methodology, particularly the social science methodology, that is not going well in terms of, and I think there were glimpses of this even in yesterday's discussions, in terms of how social science mimics other sciences by inquiring and stopping at discovery. And I'm not saying that we are all doing this, but I'm saying that the scope of venturing into intertwining intervention is something that is much more expective of a social science, and it is not being done optimally. And so social science does not enmesh discovery with exact diagnosis and championing all scientific disciplines, including those that are not social science, to carve relevant solutions. And I was really touched when I heard Jeffrey Sachs keeps drumming this idea that you can do something, because I think that is where we are all diagnostic to a point, and not even in terms of the exactness of locations and context, but we're not necessarily interweaving the intervention. So what we saw COVID do, and I observe this even as I sit in boards and ethical review boards that look at proposals for research. What COVID did was to say that let us revise what we are doing and be conscious of the fact that both the social actor and the analysts are actually in the space now where we need to be concerned about understanding, about diagnosis, and about intervention, all the way to ethical issues involved, even as we do research. So I think that I need to emphasize this observation, because it also has a bearing on on how I see these other regions being entrapped into some kind of framework of being operated on without necessarily being allowed to interact with issues. And you will see possibly how that has bearing with the hesitation on the vaccine, for example. And so I think in 2011 already, I had started to instigate the idea of intellectual choreography. That is how I phrased it. And in some writing, I call it intellectual mapping, so that the social science is different in terms of its concern about the impact of the analysis, as well as the continuous need to forge intervention. And that is not exactly the same as as action research, but I'm not going to dwell too much on the methodology issue at the moment, and hurry to talk about how it will have a bearing on the African family and the youth. Already, even yesterday, we had spoken a little bit about issues of individualistic societies and communal societies. And where I am headed is to suggest that actually we've evolved from that. The categorization framework that we have as social scientists is actually not evolving with the issues and times. We are now into instrumentalist societies. Someone spoke about calculated thinking yesterday. We are in a kind of instrumentalist societies that relate on the basis of calculation, generism, and formulation of straitjacketing policies that people are constantly suffocating from and are wanting some kind of being themselves within. And this has bearing on what one is observing in Southern Africa. And I'm saying this based on the literature that I've read, and comparing it with the especially newspaper capturing what we have been experiencing in Southern Africa, in South Africa in particular, that what we are seeing are elements of an already suffocating and alienated family that we have in Africa, over which COVID came, and when COVID came, issues of agility, issues of wanting to do things immediately for ourselves started to be on the radar screen. And so in Africa, if we admit that there is a leaning towards a communal kind of family, then we have to recognize that generally the most embracive way, with all of the nuances that we can suggest, is a relationship between family or socialization and children, is that it takes a village to raise a child. And if that is what characterizes Southern African families generally, what we saw during COVID was amazing, because in the first instance, when we were all ordered to stay at home and all of the lockdowns happened during that time, and many of these things also came out yesterday, you could see that actually you're having withdrawal symptoms in children, you having a lack of understanding of the future. There was a generalized anxiety amongst parents, but that was also exacerbated by the fact that all of the suggested interventions of forging a life forward were happening in a context where there is inequality and there is a digital divide. There were issues of food insecurity, and one can go and describe that. It's sufficiently described in literature. There was increased gender-based violence, and by now everyone knows that almost South Africa is almost the capital of gender-based violence, and it continued. It's getting gruesome by the year. You had a situation of deep life-changing traumas happening to people because of regulation. People couldn't even go and see their relatives in hospitals because of COVID restrictions. And therefore, even the nature of death, put aside that death itself is harmful, even the manner of death and being pulled away from relatives was traumatic. There was intensification of regulation to extreme levels that resurrected almost the apartheid period, where people have had to have travel permits. They had to have travel permits to enter institutions. You had, before all of this, a very dubious relationship between public health institutions and the citizenry. And so when you actually come and then impose a single method into the whole issue and say, thou shalt vaccinate, and in fact, we are threatening, and some of us are going to enforce vaccination mandates in a society that is actually suspicious of the way that the public institutions treat the common citizen, it became really complicated, and it still is now, in South Africa especially. And so by the time solutions came, they came with a civilizing approach that actually worsened the relationships between public administration and the citizen, because they never took into account that it is a citizen that feels, that thinks, that has perceptions, and more than anything, the hurried and by the deadline solution complicated matters, even if it is scientifically justified. In other words, the social elements of executing scientifically valid interventions was not actually considered. And there's also a whole range of other personal issues pertaining to cultural rights that were suspended, and the whole thing was complicated. I'm just summarizing a little bit these, just and being mindful of time, just because I want to get into a space where I actually describe the complication of the interventions as, and at least one element of it, as being its benchmark of against the middle class. All interventions are complicated in a context such as the African setting because of the middle class benchmark that they have. So you are finding a situation where when government started to say, okay, other than locking you all down and the hard lockdowns, we are going to actively do certain things. We have procedures around isolation, we have procedures around quarantine, and we have procedures around contact tracing, and we are willing to fund and enable you in all of those things. We will even have you download an app to conscientize you of who has COVID around you, that COVID is near you, because everyone who would have been tested would have had their numbers somewhere in the system. You, when vaccination came, you will have electronic registration. All of them, these interventions, actually assumed the average middle class. No one translated what isolation means in that one room informal settlement. No one translated what it means to say that you're going to do contact tracing in these congested taxis that people are using. No one actually translated what quarantine and isolation means. Please excuse me, someone is doing the grass and it's making a noise. Sorry about that, joys of working from home. No one translated all of these things for the common, the average citizen of the countries. More than that, what happened is that when you then get into a space where you give up on us understanding each other within our own context in this rigid regulation, and you listen to the global social justice moves, which are quite appreciated. They themselves were trapped into the middle class kind of assistance. Thou shalt not discriminate when you distribute vaccines to discriminate African countries. Well, in the first place, African countries are grumpy about the fact that no amount of own effort to do anything is recognized out there. In fact, anything that even raises its hand or head is quashed and never to be known in terms of where it happened before. There were elements of research in Lesotho, elements of research in South Africa that were intermixing the indigenous medicine with laboratory work. No one ever followed on that. So when the sympathy only comes as a form of thou shalt not discriminate African countries, with what we import and impose on them, it actually exacerbates the fear, and it actually exacerbates even conspiracy theories, because there is no engagement with the African as the thinker. Do not donate only insofar as you are spared by expiry dates. Afford people psychological counseling, because some of them are hesitant because they are scared of needles. All of these things do not bode well, because the African is not engaged in all of it. It is a pouring approach to the African kind of thing. And I've covered all of the things about the suspicion that already existed, the trauma of regulation, even historically. In an apartheid South Africa, for example, fathers were stripped naked and scrutinized for syphilis before they were given a permit to do something. Today, everyone is supposed to either be vaccinated in many other institutions, or submit medical records to some screening committee before being given an exemption. It just resurrects certain kind of socio-political patronizing elements that should have been thought of before a medical health, pure health kind of approach was imposed on communities. I just want to therefore say, in all of the middle class centeredness of the socio-global justice that is apparent, the issue of herd immunity has not been explained in a way that sits well with context of various countries, and especially I can speak confidently about Southern Africa. And that element, which is crucial in curbing COVID, should have been primary and integrated in all of these approaches. And so the sum total implication of all that I have described is that the African family was reduced into an operated on unit that contributed very little to the approach of COVID-19 and could not even have a voice to be considered. Secondly, the issue was reflected in institutional reduction of people into statistics for regulation and management, and as well as the subsequent bullying approach towards vaccination. And then thirdly, global empathy played straight into the hands of that science capitalism, in that it was silent about lack of indigenous expression to management of COVID. It marketed vaccines only, and inadvertently silenced the local voice in the bid to lobby for vaccination equity. So all of this over an alienated consciousness of an African family created a situation in the end that endorses the bottom status of Africa in the ladder of conceptual and professional sovereignty. And as I conclude, Chair, I want to say that the paper goes on to actually talk about the practical decisions of the family in this plethora of things, and which package to choose and which to ignore in terms of survival, both economically and in terms of health. But it also emphasizes that the decision of an African child about formulating themselves as a thinker and a potential professional in the space of global consciousness is limited to what they see every day, the mastery of mimicry, which we, as even the scientists in universities, are doing in this space when we pull our suitcases and go to conferences elsewhere without necessarily being able. We were shown up during the pandemic, because all we are ever able to do is to say what the others are producing is fine, dear community. And that is the context within which holism is happening. That is the kind of youth we have brewed in Africa. And I shudder to say that it is coming back to bite us, because of the over-exerted formalistic environment that we are in. Instead of a child being raised by the community, what we've seen in our context is that it has taken a global village to silence the African. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so very much for and perspective. It reminds me, well, first, it reminds me of the work of Paul Farmer and the conversation we were having the other day about how, Ashish, how public policy folk come up with these grand ideas that are so disconnected from the folks on the ground, and these middle class centeredness perspectives that we come up with in these lofty halls are so disconnected from people on the ground. And unless we work with anthropologists and have conversations with folks on the ground and come up with solutions, they will not work. So thank you for making this important, conscientious, impassioned, well thought through plea and reminder to all of us. And I'm sure we will come back to this conversation. Please stay with us. And I now, in the interest of Swiss timing, I turn it over to our colleague, Mary Waters from Harvard, who will talk about folks in the diaspora, the pandemic and the children of immigrants. Mary, thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Carola, and thank you, Marcelo and Professor Zamani and the Academy for having me here. I'm very honored to be presenting here today. So we could start the PowerPoint. Yes, okay. I'm going to talk today about the children of immigrants, primarily in the United States, but also in the European Union, and how they have experienced the pandemic. And I think there are some through points with the previous speakers in terms of the differential impact on people at the bottom of the social hierarchies, and also about the erosion of social trust that has, I think, characterized many of our societies, and the ways in which children really suffer from that lack of inclusion. So just to begin with, immigrants are our future. As European and American native-born populations age and our fertility rates go down, children are much more diverse and much more represented by immigration. In the US, there are 45 million immigrants. It's about 14% of the population. Another 38 million people are native-born with at least one immigrant parent, the second generation. And so together, these are more than 26% of the population. So in the US, 1 in 4 children are the child of an immigrant, 18 million children. So in the European Union, 5% of the total population are non-EU citizens, 8% were born outside the EU. In other countries in Europe, they have very high percentages of immigrants. In Iceland, it's 1 out of 5, Norway 15%, UK 14%, in the Ukraine it's 11%. So immigrants are a very large proportion of our society, and in the pandemic there was not really explicit planning or outreach to immigrants, and this was a big problem. In terms of thinking about the impact of the pandemic on the children of immigrants, we're at the really beginning of gathering data and analyzing this subject. We do know that immigrants are on the front lines. They're at the in low-wage work, and so they were differentially impacted by the pandemic. Health and mortality data generally are collected by race and ethnicity in the United States, by sex, by age, not so much by nativity. So it's difficult sometimes to tease out immigrant-specific rates. But what we do know are that the estimates that we have for COVID deaths and sickness are absolutely underestimated. That, and as we're looking now at excess mortality each year, we see that COVID had a much larger impact on our societies. There were many, many COVID deaths and illnesses that were not coded as COVID. So the impact is even much higher. So why are children of immigrants or children in immigrant families at risk? First, they are generally from racial and ethnic backgrounds that are different than the white majority societies that they have immigrated into. Secondly, the parents in immigrant families work in occupations which were at very high risk for getting COVID early in the pandemic. Immigrants tend to live in intergenerational households, and so when immigrant parents worked in places where they were more likely to get sick, that meant that grandparents who were living in the household got sick and were at higher risk of mortality. Documentation status has made a very big impact on how people experience the pandemic, both in terms of cutting people off from insurance, but also keeping people from seeking help when they were sick because of fear of the authorities, fear of being caught if they should seek medical care. The other thing is that families were isolated. The borders were closed immediately once the pandemic occurred, and even if people had the ability to, because they had documentation status, the ability to go back home or to reunite with their family members, this was stopped because the borders were closed, and so people were left without extended kin to help them through the pandemic. So what we do know are that parents and grandparents were at great risk because of their characteristics. And we know that then children of immigrants, we talked about the growth of people who had lost caregivers, the growth of people who were orphaned by the pandemic. Children of immigrants are much higher risk than children of natives for a parent death or a grandparent death and serious illness. And in countries where we do have some data available by nativity, immigrants had much higher rates of positivity of COVID cases. So in Sweden, 32% of those testing positive were immigrants in the first year. In Norway, 42%. In the province of Ottawa in Canada, 44%. In Italy, immigrants were more likely to be diagnosed late, hospitalized, and admitted to an ICU. So in the US, where we don't have nativity data, we do have data by race and ethnicity. Latinos had much higher rates of getting COVID, of being hospitalized, and of dying from COVID. In the state of Minnesota, researchers were able to find nativity data on race, on deaths from COVID. And immigrants had twice the mortality rate of natives. And much more to the point of how it impacted children, the immigrants who died were mostly working-aged men. So children were at risk of losing their fathers. And so this is just a figure that looks at the black bars are the foreign-born and the white bars are the native-born. And what we know is that immigrants are concentrated in the working ages. And if you look at all COVID mortality, it's very high among the people over age 80. But if you look specifically at the mortality of Latinos and Blacks and Asians, you find that it skews to the left. It is the people who are dying young and leaving behind children. So 120,000 children in the US lost a primary caregiver, either a parent or grandparent who took care of them. Another 22,000 lost a secondary caregiver, a grandparent who was primarily giving them, taking care of them. Hispanic children were much more likely than whites to lose a caregiver, and as were Blacks and Asians. And the highest rates of losing a caregiver were among Hispanic kids at the border. As I said before, these are all underestimates because they're based on diagnosed COVID cases and not on excess mortality, which is much higher. So immigrants were very much on the front lines, are still very much on the front lines. They are in both Europe and the US, they're concentrated in healthcare and in the low-paid jobs in healthcare, taking care of the elderly, taking care of people in hospitals. They're also overrepresented in places that didn't shut down when all of us were working from home. They work in agriculture, they work in meat packing, they work in service industries. They were also much more at risk of losing their job and losing hours, and so they lost a lot of income. The US responded very quickly with a couple of massive aid programs to families and to individuals in the US. And these were very cruelly designed to exclude not only undocumented immigrants, but anyone who lived with an undocumented immigrant. So the CARES Act and the other acts that that gave unemployment aid, that gave aid for people to avoid eviction, and that increased food stamp aid, all of them were designed so that if you didn't have a Social Security number, if anyone in your household didn't have a Social Security number, you could not get the aid. So citizen children who were entitled to this aid were denied it because they were not included because of this rule. And it was very cynically designed this way. The other very cruel coincidence was that in February, right before the lockdown, the Trump administration instituted what's called they tried to institute what's called the public charge rule, which was to say that any immigrant, even if you were legal immigrant, even if you were a citizen, if you had used any government aid, including going to the emergency room and getting Medicaid or asking for food aid, you would not be allowed to become a permanent resident. And we were in the field doing research with Latino immigrants during this period and then in the pandemic. And even though there were a lot of court suits against this, it was never really instituted. And even though it wouldn't have had the worst effects that people thought it would, the idea of the public charge rule became known across the immigrant community, and people were terrified, actually, of getting any food aid for their children, terrified of going to the hospital, because they thought it would prevent them from ever being able to sponsor anyone to come to the US and prevent them from becoming permanent residents. As a result, there was a real rise in food insecurity among immigrant families at the same time that churches and food pantries were closed down because of the pandemic rule. So there was a really large rise in hunger among immigrant families. And surveys have documented this. 41% of poor immigrant families in December 2020 reported food insecurity in the past year. 43% anticipated it in the next month. So we know that there are going to be long-term effects of this on children's health, physical health, and of course, their emotional health. We've talked a lot in this conference already about the interruption of education for children, and I think immigrant children experienced all of the problems that all children globally experienced with the loss of schooling. But I think especially online schooling was more difficult for immigrant children because their parents don't know the school system, don't know the curriculum, and in many cases don't know the language. So the kids were really on their own. Also, the parents were working outside their homes, and sometimes there were not people available to help watch the children. A lot of kids were left on their own. And the other really important part that I want to stress is that immigrant kids are integrating into the United States. They're becoming Americans. And where that happens very much is in schools. So the interruption of schooling interrupted integration. It interrupted their ability to learn the language, to make friends, to learn the norms of the society. It cut them off from this process of integration, which we know occurs pretty rapidly for kids. And so this was another added issue for immigrant children. Pandemics historically have always led to scapegoating and prejudice. Jews were blamed in the Middle Ages for the plague. Throughout American history, we have excluded immigrants based on the idea that they're bringing in diseases. And this came about very quickly in the US. So Republican governors in Texas and Florida blamed Latino immigrants for rising cases. Politicians like Trump exacerbated the fears that people had by blaming Chinese people for the pandemic, calling it the Chinese flu and the Kung flu. And anti-Asian prejudice and hate crimes soared during the pandemic, creating fear among immigrants and their children. So the average, this is an organization that's tracked anti-Asian hate crimes, and the average up until 2019 was that there were around eight reported per year, and it increased tenfold to 81.5 anti-Asian attacks. This, there were several murders that got a lot of news attention. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that immigrant children are only victims from the pandemic. In many ways, I think that they can be models of the resilience and ingenuity that they bring to American society. A lot of work, including Carola and Marcelo's and my own on the children of immigrants, points to their resiliency, to their cultural creativity, their ability to react to new circumstances, to create new cultural ways of dealing with things that is very much a model for what all of us were forced to do in the last 2 years. That circumstances changed quickly. We had to develop new norms about when we put on a mask and when we took it off, and new ways of dealing with the world. And immigrant children have done that. Immigrant parents have done that. And so there's ways in which I think that they were ahead of us in terms of understanding how to deal with these new circumstances that we now live in. The pandemic, and a number of people have talked about this through this conference, provides a window for both negative change and positive change. And two that I want to point out that happened in the last 2 years was that there was a change to our policies about immigrants and detention. And I also want to talk about the child allowance and child poverty. So detention centers and border camps where immigrants are detained. We currently have a Remain in Mexico program where people who are trying to come into the US are forced to remain in tent cities on the Mexican side of the border. We also have a lot of undocumented immigrants that have been kept in detention centers, and all of these places were places where COVID ran rampant, where people were together and there was no way to socially distance. So the rates of COVID were quite high in these detention centers. And by December, cases were 3 times higher than in the general population. The EU reported very high rates in their migrant welcome centers and detention centers. So what happened was these governments decided, well, we could let people out. So they, the number of people in detention had reached its peak of 55,000 people per day in the US. And by the spring of 2021, it was down to 14,000 people. And this is because they provided alternatives to detention. They gave people ankle bracelets. They just released them and gave them court dates. In Europe, 2 writers describe it as the short summer of abolition. There were declines in detention in Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Sweden. Spain closed all their facilities and declared a moratorium on detention. The UK reduced its detention numbers by 70%. So here's the US, and you can see this, these statistics start in 2001. We're at, by 2021, we're at a lower rate than we had since before 2001. There are only 14,000 people in detention. You can see the increase there. This is the same data. You can see the increase under the Trump administration and then this precipitous drop. So what this proves, of course, is that we didn't need to be keeping these people in detention, right? They were not a risk to our society. They were parents, they were children who were being kept in prisons, right? And so this shows that when the society decides to, we could just end detention. It's going back up again, but we realized that we could stop. So the child allowance is another example. Very, very quickly, the child allowance was instituted in the United States, over $3,000 per family if you had children in these ages. The checks just appeared in people's bank accounts because they had filed their income tax. It was flawlessly done. It was quick, and the undocumented were once again excluded. But what this did was it cut child poverty between 1/3 and 1/2. The effects were remarkable. It was easy. And we also, once again, proved that when we had a will, we could do this. We could end detention and we could lift people out of poverty. Unfortunately, the detention numbers are rising again, and the child allowance was not renewed, and child poverty is going back up again, starting in January. So it's a missed opportunity, but it is an example that we can do things better. Immigration is likely to rebound and be even higher, and of course, the Ukraine war is creating refugees as we sit here. People are walking miles and miles across borders. The planning for the next pandemic has got to explicitly include immigrants. We have to do better in terms of thinking about them as our population, because immigrants and their children are our collective future, and they are us, and we are them, and we cannot treat them as any less, which is what we have done throughout this pandemic. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary, for cutting to the chase and laying out the most important dilemmas facing this particular population, which is, as you say, a huge part of our society and our future. So thank you very much for that. It is now time for us to open it up for a full conversation and discussion and questions. So I open up the floor. Jeff. And then.
Oops. That was a wonderful presentation, Mary. Thank you very much. I wonder whether it would be possible and interesting to compare the terms of assistance across different countries regarding immigrants or undocumented people and so forth. All of our societies are stressed right now, but the kinds of restrictions that the US put on seem to me to have a very deep history with a very long British and American tradition of exclusion. It almost sounds like the poor laws of 1604 or 1834. There was always in British poor law tradition an incredible concern, we will not help you if you don't belong here. And so registration, local membership in a parish and so forth were strictly defined terms, and the purpose of these laws was always semi-punitive, either semi or fully punitive. So it just seems to me there's a lot of revelation about culture in this, and it would be nice to know if there are comparisons with what other countries did and whether that reflects different patterns and different cultural responses.
Yeah, so maybe some of our European colleagues can help with what happened here during the pandemic, because I haven't, I don't know enough about that. But you're right, the public charge law is actually from the 19th century and is one of the first exclusions that we ever had for immigrants, was the idea that they might become a public charge. And it has been selectively enforced throughout our history. It was used during the Depression to repatriate a lot of Mexican Americans, many of them US citizens. They were just put on trains and sent back to Mexico. So the public charge rule is baked into our immigration history, and it's been on the books. Trump weaponized it against immigrants just during his administration, but it does have deep roots in our history.
Yes, thank you. I have a question for both Mary and Pearl. Let me start from what just said by Jeff. It's very relevant. I think I totally agree. And in fact, to provide just an hint, we have to go back to the Greek-Roman civilization. The basic idea of the Greek civilization was polis, which we translate from which political, etc. The key concept of the Roman civilization was civitas. What is the difference? That the polis model is an excluding model. Unless you were born in Athens or in Greece, you have been considered foreigners. And only mercy could try to help the foreigner. But the civitas model was the opposite. You see, provided that you accepted the laws of the Roman Republic or Roman Empire, you became immediately Roman. To all effect, how many emperors were not born in Rome? They were born in Africa, Northern Africa. That is something that people forgot. Now, it seems to me that we have, in a sense, to go back to that, because the Anglo-Saxon world, they followed the Greek model. That is the point. And now I have no time to provide the evidence, all the literature of that, but that is what we have. Now, to this regard, let me mention an example of what you said in the end of your very important presentation. I live in Bologna. Bologna is a city. Now, last month, the Bologna Council, the municipality, passed a sort of not a law, because it's a local level, whereby they introduced what they call virtual citizenship. Now, in Italy, we do not have a law, because the opposition of few right-wing political parties does not prevent our parliament. So what the Bologna municipality did was the following. that the children of immigrants, they are, from the point of view of the local administration, equalized to the natives in terms of access to schools, access to health services, etc. If you look at the figures in this pandemic, are completely different from those of Bologna, which means, why do I say so? Because this is something that can be done by every city. Even though our parliament do not reach an agreement, but why do not try the so-called bottom-up approach? And that was possible because the civil society in Bologna reacted already a couple of years ago, and that was the result. Of course, some people, they said we would not agree, but that agreement was passed, that it's really important. Now, if I may, I can also raise a question for Pearl. Now, Pearl, you made a wonderful presentation, but I don't know whether or not you realize that what you said introduces a sort of pragmatic contradiction, not logical, but pragmatic. Because what you are saying is that, and I very much like your approach, the fact is that when the children which are brought up according to your model, which, as you know, you can teach us, is the Ubuntu model, which is a typical word of the African native languages, they enter, when they reach the adult age, enter the market economy setup, they get into trouble. Because you see, the market economy is based on efficiency. On the other hand, the Ubuntu approach is based on effectiveness and on relational goods. So what you described, stressing the lack of relationality, etc., the fact that you said when you are sick, you are psychologically isolated. So you do not need, it's not enough to provide you with medicine. Medicine are important, but they are not all. Because if you are desperate or if you feel lonely, that is not enough. So perhaps you should consider, Pearl, that we, in one way or another, we have to cope with this aspect. Finally, you mentioned the model of the African family. As you know very well, next month, this academy will have a plenary session specifically dedicated to the family as a natural, a social institution. And one of the topics is exactly the plurality of family models. And since I take it for granted that you will participate as a member of this academy, perhaps you might develop even further your argument to indicate how we can conceive a sort of a convergence between different models of family. Because after all, children are brought up initially within the families. So thank you very much again, Pearl, for your presentation.
Pearl, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for the comments. They will certainly enrich the analysis and the conceptualization of this. The issue of the contradiction, I mustn't be misunderstood to be saying that Africans want nothing to do with the imported medicine. In fact, in South Africa, we are halfway through vaccinating the population under very difficult situations of persuasion and some degree being forced through mandates in various institutions. But there are people, and we've lived a life of duality in terms of practice in many areas of South Africa, in the sense that populations have embraced change that is also acculturation to some extent. They also know that they have dilemmas that are unique to themselves. If you talk about Ubuntu and how it creates a form of empathy and socialization that says that we are all in it together. But at the same time, if I mentioned the middle class, I'm not mentioning it in an uncomplicated way, because many people know how it is to evolve to be middle class as a person with your nuclear family, but still be responsible for the extended family. And this is where the concept of black tax comes from in South Africa, where certain people and their nuclear families have graduated, if I may put it that way, into middle class status, but they are responsible for so many things to do with the extended family. So it's a very interesting contradiction, pragmatic contradiction at a personal level, that which you wonder, how are we able to sift and exclude in the considerations of intervention? Because we all know that people are confronted with a broad range of poverty-related issues, secular migration between the urban and the rural area in pursuit of the economy, and all sorts of complications. And so I think I really welcome the idea of nurturing this idea and elucidating how politics and policies and regulation has complicated the family, in addition to the various types that family is, but how it has been complicated by politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Melissa?
Thanks. And thank you for these amazing presentations. I really appreciate them. Mary, you mentioned policies that exclude certain classes of children. And the US and many other countries in the world seem to be expert at categorizing certain categories of human beings that are worth less than others. These same COVID-related restrictions have been applied to people in the sex trade, explicitly, economically against women in strip club prostitution, online prostitution, sugar daddy dating websites. If a woman was discovered in the US to be receiving money from the sex trade, she was denied any emergency assistance and the child benefit payment. Japan also did this, and both countries have been denounced by human rights lawyers for doing that. The Netherlands, on the other hand, issued an emergency stipend to everybody in the country monthly, and it lasted for quite a while. I think it's been stopped now, but it lasted for a long time. And what was interesting to me as a sex trade researcher is that women in the sex trade in the Netherlands use that stipend to get out of prostitution, to get out of harm's way. And I'm sure that's also true of, or would have been true of, immigrants' families who were offered this kind of economic protection, emergency protection. So thanks for that. And I also wanted to ask you a question. You know, the 24-hour news cycle. I am unaware, and it crosses my mind late at night when I'm laying in bed, where are these children who were separated from their parents? What has happened to them? I'm not hearing anything about them. It's like the horror stories ended and then nothing. Can you tell us anything about those kids?
Yes. Thank you, Melissa. The Biden administration has been slowly trying to find the parents of the children who were taken away by the Trump administration. and have tracked down the majority of them. But there still are some who are in foster care in the US who they still have not found the parents because they didn't keep any records to be able to reunite them. I'm not sure what the actual number is right now, but even in the pandemic, there are over 100,000 unaccompanied minors who have come to the border. And those are the only people who have not been forced to, well, for a while, Trump was even forcing the unaccompanied minors to stay in Mexico. The Biden administration has kept this horrible policy of keeping families in Mexico, but they have allowed the unaccompanied minors to come in. And they are being a little bit better about letting them reunite with relatives who are in the US, which is what most of these kids want to do. They come with the name of an aunt or an uncle or a parent. But of course, the Trump administration had stopped them.
Thank you so much for 3 extraordinary presentations. I think the first homework we all had when the pandemic began was to reread Albert Camus' The Plague. And I think the metaphor that Camus articulated in that in that book is that the pandemic made us all refugees. I think that's such a profound insight. So 3 separate reflections. First, paraphrasing the great Abba Eban, the enemies of immigration never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And the historical pattern that you outline is so on point. The Jewish disease was TB. The French disease was syphilis. This grotesque, vulgar Kung flu. In the history of immigration to the United States, the paradigm of legality, which is the fundamental Cartesian binary that structures the imaginary on how we think about immigration, is legal, unauthorized. This is new, Mary, you know this. The early prototype, because the idea of visas, this is all very new. The original framework was a medicalized framework. In Ellis Island, they didn't have attorneys. In Ellis Island, they didn't have folk looking at. Ellis Island was a medicalized. We took the crew of MSNBC to spend a couple of days in Ellis Island with Lawrence O'Donnell, and the doctors would look for 3 things. What is this, glaucoma? Very contagious, the disease? They were looking for that. They were looking for TB, and they were looking for the people walking up the stairs. So you come into Ellis Island, and you have to walk up. And they were medical judgments. They were not the kinds of bureaucratic judgments that we see today. So this is very, very old. So that's a reflection and a thank you. And thank you also for pointing out the cruelty. This is government by cruelty that purposefully and surgically design issues to hurt categories of vulnerable persons. What I see as a common theme in the 3 reflections is, of course, they capture entire universes. Kiran, my dear friend, India is a universe. It's a world. Africa is a universe. Could you like the matter of immigration? Mary, I think 3 of the 4 Nobel Prize winners for the United States in the sciences were immigrants. It's the best of times for immigrants. A lot of them are poor people escaping horrific. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about these internal differences that you see, Kiran, in India, Pearl, in Africa, and Mary, in the world of immigrants. I think, and Ashish will help me here, but I think 2 of the vaccines were developed either by immigrants or by the children of immigrants in the United States. So thank you for just the beauty and the eloquence of your presentations.
Let's start with Kiran, please.
She had to leave.
Right.
Yes, she's not in the room.
Okay, all right. Well then, Pearl, please, could you join us and comment?
Okay. I think that it is interesting to talk about internal differences in a country in Southern Africa, but more so in a country like South Africa. In the paper, I spent some time explaining what an African family is, merely because of the harmonious conflict, if I may put it that way, that we live with in South Africa. Eventually, in this wrestle with what an African family is, I end up speaking about geography and speaking about loyalty and people self-defining along those terms, because there is no way that one can capture very easily the differences in Africa and the links with the outside of the continent that those differences self-generate without necessarily walking into a turmoil of conflict conceptually, especially if you're going to try to define it yourself and not involve the units that you are defining, which is what I tried by saying self-defining via geography and loyalty. Because the white families, the Indian families, the African families, and a whole range of people that are seen as immigrants and foreigners in South Africa, all find space in this definition of the African family. They also sit in a relationship that makes them look towards each other. If we are talking about their relationship with the resources, and in this particular paper, I was trying to establish a link between knowledge as a resource. Yesterday, I think it might have been Sarah who really took us through something that she called pedagogies of belonging. In South Africa, the pedagogies of epistemology, or rather the epistemology of belonging, if I may put it that way, is really complicated. It is at the core of people excluding each other in the resources of knowledge and feeling more amenable with the fact that they have generated the knowledge more than others inside the country. Before we even talk about the fact that some of them hold important positions with regards to vetoing what comes and is acceptable and what can be promoted via use of labs and all the sort of resources that we have. It's complicated when you even begin to talk about patents and the relationship between our universities and the machines and all of the things, the resources that are serviced from Japan and from other countries. Actually, you begin to see how bare we are and how we sort of like propound the Western machinery of the African being operated on. But I think that what I'm really hurrying to, as I wrap up, trying to illustrate here is this idea of how vaccination being stifled by conspiracy theories is actually quite shallow as an explanation, because it's much, much more complicated when you do not involve the people concerned in terms of understanding what their issues are. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Mary, did you want to say or comment back? And then Ashish I know you have a question. Yes? Okay, Ashish.
So Mary, I ask you a question that I just wonder if you can reflect on. And I'm playing maybe pop sociologist here, so I'm hoping that a real sociologist will set me straight on this. It has struck me, and certainly watching the pandemic, but before the pandemic even, this notion of solidarity, social solidarity, seems to be at some tension with immigration. And that as immigration rises, that solidarity gets weaker. So first of all, is that true, or am I just doing a very superficial analysis? Because I'd love to understand that better. And then how do you think that that played out in the pandemic? Because so much of a response to a common disease requires social solidarity, this faith in government. There's some really nice analysis published a couple of weeks ago in The Lancet that looked at national responses to the pandemic. And the biggest predictor of success was trust in government, but actually more importantly, trust in each other. And if that trust in each other is affected by immigration, then that poses, for those of us who believe deeply in immigration, I'm an immigrant, it poses some important challenges for us to overcome. So I wondered if you could reflect on that.
Yes, so there's a lot of research that looks at whether or not immigration erodes the commitment in societies to one another and to redistributive policies, and there's some evidence that it does undermine it. On the other hand, if you look throughout the history of the US and many other immigrant receiving societies, we've done quite a good job of creating this idea of citizenship as being very inclusive, right? And I think historically and currently, we're still actually quite good at absorbing immigrants. My own sense is that, from the research, is that the recipe for a decline in social trust and for a lack of solidarity is a rapid rise in immigration. And we've had that for the last many decades now. And it's a bit of a race between the kind of fear that a rapid rise in immigration causes and the sense of inclusiveness that the everyday interaction with immigrants causes. So both of those things are happening simultaneously, and places like the South and the Midwest that had not much immigration and then had very rapid rises were the places where there was the most awful anti-immigrant sentiments. Places like New York and Boston and cosmopolitan cities that had been a long history of immigration and where people mix a lot, that actually doesn't happen. And then there is the match to the flame, which is the politicians that manipulate the fear that people have. And I don't think we should think about this without thinking about rising inequality in the society. So there's a reason to redirect people's attention to immigration as the cause for their problems, rather than the rising inequality, which is the real cause for their problems. So I actually think that we could go either way in terms of rebuilding social trust. But yes, the ways in which it's manipulated to take people's fears either of losing their job or of getting sick and having an easy answer to it is quite worrying.
Thank you very much. I actually have a question to Pearl, actually. So I think you really lay an important dilemma to us around the vaccine skepticism within the South African context. We hear all the time about vaccine skepticism in the US, for example, which is very tied to education and political party affiliation. And you bring the notion of middle-class centeredness and the need to have conversations with folks on the ground, really, about the reasons. I wonder if you had the ear, or perhaps you do have the ear, of people who are actually trying to roll out vaccines in an effective way. What would be your direct advice at this moment, please?
I think, let me put it this way. The head of World Health Organization had a visit recently to South Africa to see the new hub for vaccine generation, which is a good step because in the actual creation of a vaccine hub in the country, I think it's a good step that the country realized it had to do something to assure the population in the first instance that it is generating things from the soil. Of course, there are other conversations about how the actual patents, the intellectual property of it is just being supplanted into the country, but it's a good gesture. But one of the things that he mentioned in the engagement, and I think he had been briefed about the kinds of challenges that we have regarding hesitation towards vaccines, is that he then pointed out that there has been a huge delay in involving social science expertise in the whole global engagement and seeking of interventions towards the pandemic. And the whole approach has been biomedical and related to the sciences, and the sciences sort of assuming that we know that this is fine and therefore you should accept it as the solution. And it was amazing just to hear that acknowledgement. I mean, it was amazing to all of us, actually, because in here, there seems to have been generation of other identities, the anti-vaxxers and the vaxxers, the anti-mandates and the pro-mandates, and all sorts of things that have now almost, if you do this kind of thing in a country that has recently been so polarized, you almost create a science race kind of ladder, which is what we are experiencing right now. So what a useful public health approach would be is to understand the context to its most localized level, because there are issues around men and women in terms of their relationship with sickness. And to some extent, to say that people need to be counseled around needles is true, but not true for everyone. There's always been trends in South Africa of noticing that men had to be much more, there had to be much more of a campaign towards them, even during the times of HIV and AIDS around circumcision. It wouldn't happen in the Eastern Cape where circumcision is a culture, but it would happen in KZN where circumcision is an option. So to a most localized level, we needed to have deployed a social science intelligence to understand how to craft the message towards a particular community. But they are complicating things at a country level, such as what I was hinting about how the whole idea of giving people certificates to enter a particular place resurrects the issues that were happening to minors when they were stripped naked and scrutinized and then given papers. There was also, and people are asking these things on a daily basis, we needed to explain how we arrived at vaccines so quickly. Because South Africa, having been so infected by HIV and AIDS, lived through a situation where scientists would go away and come back and tell people, it will take 10 years for a cure, for anything to come up. So they got used to the idea that it's not urgent. And they are suspicious when everyone is dying, all of a sudden there is a solution. It needed to be explained how over time the medicine progression is such that it was possible to do this, so that in fact they do not end up believing the conspiracy theories. It's complicated, but it's doable. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Pearl. Thank you so much, Kiran, and thank you, Mary, for your wonderful presentations. We learned so much. We are now going to take a break for half an hour, and then we will return at 11:15.
Rome.
Thank you. Rome time.